All right, so this week's Parsha is quite an interesting one, and it's an interesting Parsha to start with, because has anybody had a look at the Parsha? Feel free, raise your hand. Yeah.
I think if you're talking about Leviticus 12, yes.
Yes, correct.
And you started telling me
14.
it's interesting, and I'm not so sure it's interesting. So maybe you'll make it interesting.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So it's a surprising Parsha to start with, but it is the weekly Parsha. But we'll see that I think we'll have some enjoyable learning in this Parsha. So first, a little bit of an overview of it. It's called Tazriah and Metzorah. It's two Parshas this week, two Torah portions. Sometimes you have a combination of two portions, and this is how we read the Torah throughout the year. It's timed in such a way that it completes from the Shabbos, from the Shabbat after Simchas Torah, after the holidays, until the Simchas Torah of the next year. We complete all the Parshas, and because not every year has exactly the same layout, of when the holidays come out, etc., and if there's a leap year or not. So sometimes there are two Parshiot that are combined and read during 1 week. So this week we've got two together, Tazriah, Metzorah, but their topics are interconnected. Tazriah and Metzorah really all talk about mainly one main topic. But you know what I'll do is I'll go first through a run-through of the topics that are covered, and then we'll focus on them individually. So the Parsha starts with the laws related to childbirth. And right now I'm not going to go into the details, just an overview. Laws related to childbirth, that when a mother gives birth, she becomes ritually impure. We'll talk about that. And it talks about briefly the mitzvah of a bris, a boy after 8 days. And it talks about how she emerges from this state of impurity in a gradual process. And then at the end of which there is also going to the mikvah, and then there's bringing an offering in the temple. Then the main topic is the law of tsaras, which means usually translated as leprosy, but it's not really the accurate translation, as I'll explain, because tsaras is an affliction, number one, of the skin. Person that gets some sort of affliction that usually appears as white patches on the skin. There's various types of it that the Torah talks about in great detail, which can almost be hard to follow, hard to understand. But with the help of the commentaries and the Talmud and Maimonides, etc., they really lay it out in very clear detail what the laws were regarding tsaras. It's a certain minimum size of a patch on the skin, and then it talks about if it's spotted, and you go to an expert. An expert analyzes it and sees if it is considered tsaras or not. They will go to the Kohen, which is a priest and a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. All the Kohanim are descendants of Aaron. So you go to the Kohen. The Kohen, if the Kohen is an expert, the Kohen rules on it himself. If he's not an expert, he relies on the expert's analysis, but the Kohen has to be the one to declare it, whether it is impure or pure, whether it is considered tsaras or not. And if it is considered tsaras, then there are certain laws that that fall into place. There's stages. If you're not sure, the person has to be quarantined for a week. A lot of related themes. You have to be quarantined for a week. He checks it after a week. If in certain conditions, if it hasn't spread but it hasn't gotten better, he's quarantined for a second week. If after 2 weeks of quarantine, it hasn't gotten worse and it started to show signs of improvement, then the person is purified. But if at any time it's gotten worse and the tsaras has started to spread and there's various signs of the tsaras getting worse, then that person must go into complete isolation. In Hebrew, bada d'yeshev, the person has to sit alone, michutz lamachane, outside of the camp. So in the desert, let me just admit somebody. In the desert, they would go out. There was 3 camps. The Jewish people were in concentric camps. So you had on the inside, you had the temple, the tabernacle, the Mishkan. and then you had the people that were encamped right around it, and then you had most of the tribes all around that area. And then you had outside of the camps of the tribes. So if somebody who had tsaras, this quote-unquote leprosy, had to go outside of all the camps until the tsaras cleared up. Now, in Jerusalem, meant the person had to go outside of the city, outside of the city. So this was the law of tsaras. And after the person has gone through this process, they then have to go through a purification process once they're considered to be cured from tsaras, which involves going to a mikveh and a special offering of two birds. One is slaughtered, one isn't. One is set free, one is slaughtered. And there's a stick of cedar wood. There is crimson wool, and there's hyssop plant, and they're bound together, and the person is sprinkled with the water and the blood from this offering, the spring water, 7 times, and there's a mikveh, and you wait 7 days, and then a mikveh again, and then the person is purified. And then the Torah goes on to tell us that the same type of affliction happens not only in the person's physical body, but also can happen to their clothing. It's not exact, doesn't look the same, different colors, etc. But the idea of a certain discoloration that appears on a person's clothing. I think the most similar thing you can think of today is something like mold, but Torah is not describing mold, as we'll see, or it can appear on a person's house. In each case, there's a certain process of analyzing it, determining if it's tsaras, determining if it's spreading or getting better. There's isolation, there's cut if it's on clothing, or if it's in a house, the bad part is cut out. If it comes back, it means it's tsaras, and the structure must be destroyed. Now, of course, the houses then weren't like houses today, but they had to be broken down. If it's clothing garment, first they cut out the bad part. If it still spreads, then the whole garment is burnt, it's destroyed. Now, so these are the laws, and then in the second Torah portion, these laws span the first Torah portion and the second one. And the second one also goes in at the end into the laws of somebody who has a physical emission of some sort of bodily fluid that is not, well, depends on the situation. Some of them are natural, some of them are illness, and certain also time that they have to wait and purification that they have to go through. So you can definitely say that these two parshas that we talk about have a lot to do with the physical purity of the person. All right, so before I go further, any questions on this? Okay, all right. And by the way, anybody else who's on here, feel free if you want to be on video, so we can see each other. But if you just want to be audio, feel free to unmute yourself whenever you want to ask a question or say something. Okay, so while we don't have any questions, but surely there are questions that appear in our minds as we're learning about this whole idea of impurity. In Hebrew, it's called tuma v'tahara. Our sages tell us, and Maimonides makes this very clear, that the laws of tuma and tahara are not really about a physical thing. They're really a spiritual thing. And ultimately, it's about something that that is beyond, at least to the complete extent. Of course, we'll discuss it. There's a certain aspect of it that is beyond complete human understanding. It's what we call a chok, which means a decree. The mitzvot in the Torah are categorized, they fall into one of 3 categories. There's laws that are very easy to understand. For example, do not steal or do not murder. That even if God wouldn't give us these laws, we would come up with them on our own, because we would know that a society needs to have laws to control itself. Then there are laws that are called edut, testimonies, which we wouldn't come up with on our own, but once they are given to us, we could get them. We understand them. An example of these laws are, for example, the laws related to Passover, eating matzah, Shabbat, and even things like putting on tefillin or tzitzis or mezuzah. These are laws that may not necessarily be laws that we would not come up with, we would not come up with these laws. Hi, welcome, Adam. We would not necessarily come up with these laws, but once they have been taught to us, we could get them. We understand them. We can appreciate them. Let's just say that, because they're meant to remind us of something. And then you have the third category of law, chukim, which are translated as decrees. And like a decree, the idea is it's a law that is not necessarily with an explanation. It's not necessarily explained to us why, and we're not necessarily expected to understand. This is a divine order, like when to put on a mask and when not to. Don't ask why. This is how it is. In some places, you have to wear it for 30 days. In other places, you don't. Some places, I'm kidding. But we're kind of starting to relate to all of this idea of decree that some higher power gives us, and we wonder, what it's all about. Okay. So clearly, the laws of Tumah and Tahara, purity and impurity, relate very much to the idea of chukim, the idea of a decree from God. Nevertheless, we still could appreciate and understand them to a certain extent. So people often wonder, one of the biggest, first of all, the general idea is God wants us to be holy. And that's the whole idea of Tumah and Tahara. God did not give the laws of Tumah and Tahara to everyone. There are laws that apply to all of mankind. And they're known as the 7 Noahide laws and all of their branches. They don't include laws related to purity, to holiness. Those are laws that God gives to the Jewish people in the Torah because he wants us to rise up to a higher spiritual level. So that's a general idea. But people often wonder, the idea of that, for example, a woman gives birth, now she's impure. Why is she impure? She just had a baby. It's a great, joyous thing. And why is she impure? Or somebody who's had, she's her natural period, or a man who's had an emission, and why does that make you impure? And there's a beautiful explanation, and that is that we find often a great connection between opposites. And that is that the greatest positivity in our world is life, when God gives us life, right? And what's the greatest negativity? The opposite, right? The opposite of life, death. Whenever you have something really good, and then you have the exact opposite of it, or the absence of it, it creates a vacuum. Okay. So the question is what happens with childbirth, or what happens in the natural cycle? What happens is that here you have when a woman has we know the natural cycle is related to having the ability to have a child, and when that does not come to fruition, when that doesn't come to pass, there is a shedding of that, and that's what results in the period. So this is actually a great power that God created within us. And so whenever there is that loss, there is a vacuum, and the vacuum creates the opposite of holiness. So actually, it's almost it's counterintuitive, but really when you see a vacuum of see something negative, it actually implies that there could be something very great and positive there, and that's why there is the impurity at the time. So it actually teaches you quite a different perspective. Now, and I'll mention also at the end of the Parsha, since it's related to this, you have the idea of that a woman has to go to the mikvah and go through a purification process. And many commentaries have pointed out that the beauty in that, because normally in a marriage relationship can become very everyday, common, and stale, right? There is the routine, the same every day is the same thing, and it becomes boring. It was very exciting to get married. It was very exciting to date. It was very exciting to go on a honeymoon. Very exciting in the beginning, but after a while things could become boring. But when a person when you follow this cycle that the Torah talks about, where Anita cannot be, that's a woman who is menstruated, cannot be together with her husband and then goes through a purification process, what that creates is an ebb and flow in the relationship. Not the relationship doesn't go down, but there's a renewal that takes place constantly. There's a separation that the Torah is saying we should follow, not a complete separation, but a partial separation, of physical separation. And then what results is a renewal. So suddenly something that, instead of it being common and always available and every second, which makes it lose its specialty and its uniqueness in the relationship, becomes special again. And you can, and it's true. People that follow this will tell you that it is indeed very true, and it's actually something that strengthens relationships very much. Anyway, so that's the general topic. Now I'm going to go into the details of Metzorah, and that's the person who was the leper. I mean, I shouldn't use the word leper because that's not the accurate translation. Maimonides tells us that Maimonides, as we know, is a medical doctor. In addition to being a great scholar of Torah and a great philosopher, he was also, in his day, he was a physician to the Sultan in Egypt, right? So Maimonides tells us that you should not think that the whole law of tsaras, Metzorah, is a natural illness. It's really a supernatural illness. And this is in general the approach of all of Talmudic and Torah scholarship and commentary on the Torah, that they explain that tsaras was not a physical illness. It was an illness, a spiritual malady that expressed itself in a physical way. So a person had developed lesions on their skin, but it was because something inside wasn't right. There was something wrong inside, and so it resulted in an external manifestation. I'll read to you a few words from Maimonides where he talks about this. That it's it's not from the ways of the world. It's not a natural process. It was actually a sign and a wonder amongst Israel, in order to caution them and warn them away from bad talk, gossip, talking badly about people. So our sages connected the malady, the affliction of tsaras, specifically to the sin of talking badly about people. He said, in kind of an expression, someone who speaks lashon hara, which is bad talk, evil talk about others, it changes the walls of your house. In other words, it creates a bad atmosphere in the home. And then what happens? That bad atmosphere actually results in an affliction that first affects the walls of the house. If the person repents, im chazar bay, yitar habayis, the house will become pure. Imamad barishay, if he maintains his evil way, then until the wall has to be broken down, the house has to be broken. Some matter of a brick home, a stone home. Then the affliction will affect the utensils made of leather that are inside the house, that he sits on them or he lies on them. If he repents, then yitaru, then they become pure and everything is good. But if he stays wicked, amad brishay, until those things have to be burnt, then it affects his clothing. Habgadim shalom. If he changes his ways, stops speaking badly about people, then they become purified. If he stays in his bad ways until even the clothing has to be burnt, then it finally affects his skin, and he becomes a Metzorah, and he has to separate himself from everybody, and everybody finds out that this person must have been practicing lashon hara, bad talk about people, because look, he was affected with tsaras, first on his house, then on his leather items in the house, the couch, etc., the chair, and then his garments, and then on his physical person. Now, we know that in the Torah, that lashon hara, bad talk, is considered one of the severest sins amongst people, because it's so destructive. When you read Psalms, for example, from King David, Tehillim, a lot of the Psalms, he's expressing the pain of the idea of people speaking Lashon Hara, people speaking badly about him, people speaking badly about others, the spears that come from their tongue, that stab a person. It's simply so destructive. So our sages said about it that the Hebrew name for tzaras, for the person who suffers it, is called Metzorah. That's the name of the person who has tzaras. And Metzorah, they said, is like a combination of three words: Motzi, Shem, Ra. A lot of times the sages would point out that words that almost seem like they are abbreviations, and they contain within them more information. Metzorah, the person who has Metzorah, is Motzi, Shem, Ra, which means he gives out a bad name. He speaks badly about people, ruins people's reputation. We know in the Torah that with Miriam and Aaron, when they spoke negatively about Moses, right away they were afflicted with tzaras. Actually, Miriam she was the one who was speaking. And even though she was well-intentioned, we're not going to go into the details of the story, but because they were on such a high level spiritually, there's a general rule of thumb that the higher a person stands, the more exacting God is with them in judgment. And it doesn't necessarily, and it's not a punishment. It's simply because when you stand at a higher place, everything matters more. Like the difference between a mistake that an official makes, right, versus a person in their private home. You make a mistake in your private home, okay, no big deal. You could try to correct it. If you're an official, you're running a city or a country, responsible for an army or a battleship, well, your small mistake has bigger ramifications. Or if your job is you're putting together a space shuttle, right? Your small mistake has big ramifications. Okay. So what's the cure, the remedy for the Metzorah? So the Torah says you take, part of the process of the healing involves a piece of cedar wood, which we know is a very tall tree, hyssop, which is a very small plant, crimson wool, and you bind them together, and there's a whole procedure. The question is, what is the significance of these specific items? Our sages tell us in the Talmud that the cedar, the tall tree, the cedar, represents arrogance. And that is someone, because arrogance is seen as the core of all bad ways and all sin. A person, just like the opposite, humility and bittul, the Hebrew term that's used in Chassidus, is the essence of being connected to God. Arrogance is, give me 1 second. I just muted everybody, not for any problems, but feel free to, it makes it run a little better. Feel free to unmute yourself at any time to ask a question or a comment. So arrogance is the essence.
Rabbi, I'm surprised that cedar has a negative connotation to it.
Oh, okay, good question. So let me finish explaining, and maybe we'll understand. The truth is, so you're asking that it's not necessarily that it has a negative connotation. In this context, really everything that God created is positive. Cedar is a beautiful tree, and according to some, actually it was used in the temple, in the construction of the temple. King Solomon brought the cedars from Lebanon. So cedar is not a negative thing, but everything is generally positive, but it can also have a lesson, and the lesson could also be in the negative. So in this case, you take the cedar is a very tall tree representing arrogance, someone that's inflated. When we say a bracha on the food we eat, we are acknowledging and saying that Hashem is our creator, and we are connecting with what Hashem has given us for ourselves and acknowledging God. So actually, it's a moment of elevation. Hyssop, a very small plant. And crimson wool, in Hebrew, it's telas shani. I'm not going to go into the whole detail of the name, but the word telas means a worm. And that's because they would in order to make this crimson wool, they use a certain extract that they got from a particular type of insect or worm, and it was called telas shani, this red crimson wool. So the sages said, if a person has a problem with arrogance, and he's like a cedar, he should humble himself like a hyssop and like a telas, like a worm, humble himself, that he needs a remedy to cure his arrogance. And as Maimonides tells us many times, that whenever you have, normally you can go down the golden middle road. You don't have to be overly this way or that way. But if a person has a problem with something, they need to then go to a little bit of an extreme in the other way in order to make up for it. So if a person has a problem with arrogance, that person should practice an extra measure of humility until they are really cured. All right. So now what's the whole point of the tzaras? The person has sinned and is afflicted with this. First of all, we can ask the question, how come we don't see this happening nowadays? Also, can you imagine if every sin we got an affliction? So our sages explain that, and Maimonides brings this as well in his Code of Law, that tzaras, really, if a person had tzaras, really in a certain way, he told you the person was actually quite a holy person, quite an elevated person, because they were stood on such a high level that if they sinned with speaking badly and gossip, or had a problem with arrogance, that they got affected by it, and it showed externally on their body. So it meant that it's like the difference between somebody, you ever see these things? Some people can eat burgers that are layered, 5 layers thick, and it doesn't seem to affect them. Then you have a person who always eats proper healthy food. If they're going to eat something a little bit unusual and unhealthy, they can develop, some sort of ailment. Why? Because their system is used to a more delicate, right, more refined diet. And that could when they pour something in that is against it, it's like if you put in the wrong fuel into your car, a dirty fuel, it will make your car, especially if it's a fancy car, it needs a better quality fuel. So the idea is that a person whose life was they were living their lives on a proper, pretty good spiritual level, if they sinned, it meant that they were sensitive. It meant they actually otherwise were very good. In fact, the Torah uses the word Adam, ki yeh ba'ar b'sarai, it's a pachas evaharis, which means a person, Adam, a man, a human, right, who develops this affliction. And sages point out, why does the Torah use the word Adam? Because there are various terms for a person in the Torah, in Hebrew. There's Adam, there's Ish, Ish or Isha, Enosh. There's different terms. Gever is a man. Why Adam? They explained that Adam is the highest term for human. There's other terms, and they apply a person on a different spiritual level. Adam is the highest term. Just like Adam was the first human, was complete and perfect, Adam is the highest term. So here it uses Adam. A person on a high spiritual level gets affected by tzaras. Since we are no longer generally in such a level, so this illness, this malady no longer is present. Now, Rashi, in the beginning of this Torah portion, comments. Very first Rashi, the commentary on the Torah.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
isn't it true though that when you do get afflictions, aren't there times God is punishing you? Like, that's not a blessing. If you have an affliction, he could have prevented it, he could have protected you, but he let the affliction take place, or he made it so you did get an affliction. So potentially, right?
Well, Renee, that's a great question. So, if an affliction, is it a punishment? I'm going to talk a little more about that later on in the lesson. I'm going to address that, and we'll see some interesting insights on that. So Rashi says, in the first Rashi of this Torah portion, Kishem sheyitzirase shel adam achar kol behim b'chai v'oif b'maisa bereshis kach terasa nispash achar teres behim b'chai v'oif. Just like the human being was created after all of the animals and birds in the days of creation, so too is his Torah, the laws related to the physical body of the human being and his purity and impurity, talked about after the Torah talks about the laws of the animals. Because in the previous Torah portions, Torah talks about laws related to animals, kosher animals, and so on. So it's an interesting comment. It's based on a midrash. And it's quite an interesting comment. So it seems to imply, what does it mean to tell us? We were created after all the animals. So let's look at that. What does the Talmud say about that? Talmud says, why is man created last in the days of creation? And Talmud answers two answers that are opposing one to another. One answer says man was created last because God wanted to give us a completed world and say, look, everything's ready for you. Prepared everything, come in. Right? That's a great honor. It means to say that we are like we are God's agent in creation and to complete creation. God is giving us a completed world. Everything's ready. Another answer, Talmud says, is that we were created last, that if a person misbehaves in God's world, you say to the person, who are you? Even a little bug was created before you. Who do you think you are? You were created last. What's the message? So really, this message of two opposites, we are either the star of the creation or the afterthought. Which one is it? Really points to the idea of the whole idea of the dichotomy within the person. There's one part of the person that soars high, and it's the soul, specifically the godly soul. Another part of the person is the animal, or the animal soul that goes low. And in fact, that a person, when it comes to going low, we can go lower than an animal can go. An animal is neutral. An animal only behaves according to its natural instinct. But we have free choice. So we can utilize our intelligence to really do evil things that no animal can possibly do. So we have the ability to soar really high or to go really low. If we go really low, the Talmud says, who are you? Even a bug was created before you. And even a bug is better than you because a bug does what it's supposed to do and doesn't abuse its power. On the other hand, the first message is really the main one. We should know that everything was prepared so that we can fulfill our godly purpose here in the world. And we can be Adam, the name for a human being, also, our sages point out, can be read as Adama Le'elyon, which means I am compared to the one on high, meaning we're created in the divine image. We're given tremendous power to make the world a godly place. Now, the Rebbe commented on the Maimonides that I mentioned earlier, that talks about how Maimonides, being a physician and a scholar of Torah and everything, explains how tsaras, this malady was not natural, it was supernatural, and it was there to direct the person back onto the right path. So Rebbe comments and says you can learn so much from this, that the Jewish people are accustomed, because we are ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim, which means believers, the children of believers, right? Meaning it's deeply ingrained in the mind, the heart, the soul of a Jew, our belief in God. And so when we see something happening, even though it looks like a physical malady, but we see the pattern and we see, why is this happening to me? First the house, then the furniture, then the clothing, then the body. Clearly it's supernatural. Clearly God is trying to give me a message. And that is a way how we accustom ourselves, the way we look at everything, not just the affliction of tsaras. And so it's a lesson we really can learn for now, for all time. And the time we're in, as good as any, especially now, that when we see things happening in the world, it's very easy, on the one hand, to say, yeah, it's natural. Why is this happening? Or whose fault is it? And which countries at fault? And I'm not saying from the physical side of things, people shouldn't be held accountable for bad decisions, etc., or for lying, and that's another story. But there's another perspective. You can always judge things. If a person causes a car accident, you can say the person was reckless, but still, if we were affected by it, we do have to believe that everything that happens to us does come from above. The fact that God allows this to happen, yes, people's actions are what enable it, but God allows it to happen. It means there is a divine hand running things, and we should not think that it's just by itself. So just like we look at the tsaras and we say, look, first the house, then the furniture, then the clothing, then me, I must take a lesson from this. I need to do spiritual improvement in that case, or what do I need to improve? Same here. The world as a whole is going, and at all times, and now especially going through things that we need to ask ourselves: what can we gain from this? What lesson do we need to learn from this? What do we need to improve through this? Maybe God is giving us a chance to make positive changes in our lives and in the world as a whole. And that's a great way of looking at it, and that's really the Jewish way as we're taught in the Torah. So, and so I have like one or two more ideas that I want to share to wrap this up, and then we can take some questions. Okay, so number one, there's a very interesting thing you find in the Gemara. That's the Talmud. The Gemara tells us regarding Mashiach, Messiah, and the era of redemption, and that tells us like this: Ein ben David ba, the son of David, who is reference to Mashiach, Messiah, does not come ad shetisapech kol hamalchus leminus, which until all the kingdoms, all the governments, all nations in the world, or the governments of the world, the authorities, they flip and they become heretical. Interesting. We know the time of Mashiach is a positive thing, right? Time of Mashiach means that the world is coming to its positive fruition, the way it was meant to be. And yet, the Talmud says that that won't happen until heresy spreads throughout all governments. And which is a surprising statement in its own right. And then the Talmud continues and says, I'll even give you a proof or a source in the Torah for this concept. And the Talmud points to our Torah portion and quotes these words, Kuloi hafach lavan tahar hu, which means if he's completely transformed to white, he is now pure. What is the Talmud referring to? In this Torah portion, it says, remember I said in the beginning that the affliction of tzaras appears as a white lesion. And if it spreads, it means the person is impure and has tzaras. If it shrinks, smaller than the minimum size, the person is cured and no longer impure. Have to go through the purification process. So, but there's a verse in the Torah, a fascinating verse. It says, Kuloi hafach lavan. If he completely he's changed over completely to white. In other words, a person's body is completely covered in this white lesion. All his skin turns white like that, this unnatural whiteness. Then he becomes pure. Strange. It should be worse. It should be hopeless. No, then he becomes pure. So the Talmud says like this. Now, what's the reason behind that? So one of the commentaries says, I think it's Ibn Ezra, says that since tzaras is an external manifestation of an internal spiritual problem, once the person's skin is completely turned white, what it tells you is the body or the person's completely expelled all of the negativity. And now all that's remaining is apparent and it's obvious and it's on the skin. So actually, the big problem when we try to do our own spiritual improvement is when there are issues inside of us that remain hidden and concealed. And we never deal with them, and we never explore them, and we never acknowledge them. Or if we acknowledge them, we don't have the courage to open them up and to examine them, and let alone deal with them and improve them. But once you're able to identify all spiritual malady and acknowledge it and realize that it's there, realize we have these deficiencies, now it's out all on the outside, you're basically more than 50% of the way to the cure. Because now that everything's come out, now it's only all that's left is to change positively from now on, because you've already completely identified. We all know that if you think about issues in our lives, the biggest problem is when we have trouble acknowledging and really, really, truly, and honestly saying, I have this issue, I have this weakness, I have this problem. When we can truly and honestly say it, now we're able to be healed. So that's explanation from Ibn Ezra, kind of paraphrasing, the idea that when the entire malady is out all on the outside, now the Metzorah is on the way to being healed. Tahar hu becomes pure because there's nothing left inside to fight. Now, So the Talmud uses this verse and says the same thing will happen when Mashiach comes, that all the internal spiritual malady, the internal spiritual problems, or that's not even apparent to the eye, because there is in the eye of the Torah, especially in Jewish mysticism, there is a long running history, right? History starts with Adam and Eve. The story didn't start yesterday. It didn't start when we were born. It didn't start when our parents were born. It didn't start Second World War, First World War, the century, or the last millennium. It started at the very beginning, and we're going through a story. So there's a whole spiritual background, a whole spiritual backstory that's taking place. Adam and Eve with the first sin, and the problems that resulted in, and the ups and downs. You had the big down of the generation before the flood and Noah, and then there was an improvement in Noah, and that was an up, and then some declines, and again Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they started to increase the recognition of God and people living purposefully and following God's way until the highlight, the giving of the Torah, but then there were descents. So there's this whole spiritual ebb and flow that takes place. So while it seems to be going just like waves up and down, but there is also a long story that is happening, and in the long run, we are coming to a positive goal. So we may not see the accumulation of the goodness, just like a person doesn't see if there's a battle taking place inside of the body, and if the body is being ravaged by an infection, we don't see when the turning point is, right? When the good guys, the good cells, the good bacteria, or the good part of the immune system that is fighting the illness overwhelms the illness and leads to success, but it's a story that's taking place inside. So too, the world has this hidden story, and when the most negative thing is apparent on the outside, says the Talmud, it means that the inside is basically ready now for transformation to the good. As we've cleansed it. Okay, so we have to look at it in the bigger picture, not just in the picture of our time alone. There is a verse in Daniel in Tanakh, it's chapter 12, where it says Yisparu v'Yislavnu v'Yitzarfu Rabim, which means that there will be a clarification and a purification, a cleansing that will mold and shape and purify everyone. And the verse is talking in the context of the coming of Mashiach and the redemption, that there will be a purification. Now, we know every purification is turbulence. If you put clothes into the washing machine, there's a lot of turbulence, but it's not a disaster. It's actually, you're on the way to cleansing. So when there is this type of turmoil, and as the Talmud says, the tzaras is on the surface, and the heresy seems to be dominating, etc., it actually could mean that right now what's happening is a cleansing that is really leading towards goodness, as the prophet Zephaniah says, chapter I think it's not sure if I think it's chapter 3. So he says, "Az efech el ha'amim safa brura, likrei kulam b'shem Hashem, ulavdei shechem echad," which means then, at that time, in the time of Mashiach, I will transform all of the nations to speak with a pure tongue, with a pure lip. Everybody will speak clearly, and everybody will call and identify God, the name of God, together, and they will serve God shechem echad with one. In one, with one shoulder, meaning like kind of we're all in it together. So that's our hope that happens very soon. I want to conclude with one personal idea that I heard from my father, and I told him I was going to share it. And my father was quoting a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov said, some people have, if you think about it, this thing that we're going through now, there was a certain point where I remember some people said, wow, this is bigger than 9/11, right? Bigger than 9/11. And I was like, no, really? Oh yeah, this is bigger than 9/11. It's a bigger story, bigger impact on the world. Then today, people are saying the last time you can even compare something like this as Second World War, something, and even that, in a certain way, was not as big of an impact as this, because that was still localized to certain regions. This is something, it's pretty unprecedented that the entire world, almost without exception, is dealing with the same problem. And everyone has to be in the same situation. And Badad Yoshev, sitting in isolation, like the Metzorah. By the way, it's not such a bad thing, because our sages explained the reason for the Metzorah's isolation was to give the person time to reflect and to improve. So there is a certain, of course, there is people getting sick, and we want everybody to be better, and there's a lot of pain and suffering. But there is another part to it, which is this Badad Yoshev, sitting alone like the Metzorah, was not a punishment. It was meant to give us a chance to improve. So it's actually a real gift. So it's actually, Renee, I'm kind of addressing your question earlier, that if a person sees these types of things personally as opportunities for self-improvement, we can actually, at least within our own lives, change them towards positive as much as we're able to. We can't affect everything. Look, Malki's father passed away from this. We know it's very real, but there's still another part that is happening alongside of it, and we can. And in fact, we're meant to take a lesson. When something affects others, and you take a lesson for the good, you're actually, their pain is meaningful because it's leading to positive change for others. Okay, so what did my father say? So if you, to go back a little bit, I started saying how bigger than 9/11, right? In a certain way, many people would agree, it's a bigger, wider, worldwide impact than even the world wars that we've sadly experienced in our recent history. And other things that took place. You may have to go all the way back to Mount Sinai to talk about an event that shook the world, and even further back to the flood that the Torah talks about for an event that enveloped the entire world. And the Torah teaches us that there was a whole reset with the flood. Now, this is different. This is not a flood of water, but it's a flood of another kind, something that we don't see, but we definitely know about. So what happened during the flood? Noah and his family are told to go into the Teva, go into the ark. Most people think about what happened outside of the ark, right? But really, Chassidus teaches us that what took place inside of the ark was just as important. And that for one entire year, Noah and his family that they spent inside of the ark was actually a very spiritual year, and it was a year of spiritual transformation and restoration. And that they lived in a very high spiritual way, and they got along, and everything was perfect inside of the ark. And the Torah tells us that God tells him when he goes into the ark these words in Hebrew, and I'll translate: Sohar ta'aseh lateva, which means you should make a window for your ark. That's interesting. God is telling him to make a window, like he has to be told to make a window. What is the meaning of the window? The Baal Shem Tov said that the Hebrew word sohar, which means a place of illumination. In fact, some of the sages say it wasn't a window, but it was a precious stone that glowed. That the window, or we'll just refer to it as the window, that sohar, says the Baal Shem Tov that it has the same Hebrew letters as the word tzara. Tzara means calamity. So hear this: the word that God tells him to make a window for illumination is the same word for, in different order, same letters as the word tzara, which means calamity. Says the Baal Shem Tov, that's what my father shared with me, related to now, that when a person experiences tzara, calamity, God forbid, in any aspect of life, what we need to do is we need to take that and rearrange it, tzara tzadik reish hey, and rearrange it into sohar, into a window of illumination, into a window of an opening, new insight, of new light. This is what we need to do. We need to change the tzara into tzohar, into a light, into illuminating light. So this is a tremendous lesson. If we can just remember this from today's lesson, it's such a powerful idea to live with. How do I change, and how do I do I utilize? Because we cannot change the facts, but you can change the how we accept it and how we affect it and how it affects us. We can live in anxiety, we can live under stress, we can live under worry, or we could relax. Say, okay, I'm staying home. If that's what I need to do. Some people are going for walks. Everybody according to what their safety level and everything, fine. But the main thing is not to, instead of getting stressed from it, we channel it into a window. How do I take this time and make it a window into my life that will illuminate and shine light into my teva, into my ark that I am hibernating in, that I'm isolating myself in, because that's what I need to do. So these are some lessons from the Torah portion. Hope you enjoyed it. We learned about laws of purity and impurity. We learned about a Metzorah, the person who is afflicted with a spiritual malady, that's there to remind us that that person needs to self-improve, and the importance of positive talk and positive energy.